So this is one of the things that I'm kind of really passionate about in the energy transition. There's a lot of R&D going on in the kind of energy world, but actually so many of the solutions that we need to get to net zero are already readily available and readily financeable. So, for example, hydrogen might be needed for a tiny slice of processes right at the absolute top of industry. But we already have technology to electrify the vast majority of what every business out here in the UK actually has to do. We have technology to electrify transport, we have technology to electrify building heating. All of this stuff is readily available. So my kind of core message on tech is that actually this next phase of the net zero transition is about deployment. This is about taking the technologies we already have for the electrification of all energy use and for the generation of that renewable electricity. If we just electrify everything and make that electricity net zero, then we can already do 80 or 90% of the energy transition. And that's what this phase of the transition needs to be about. It needs to be about deployment. This is a great question. And it's one of the concerns that businesses have around renewable power. And it's one of those concerns that politicians have really picked up on as well. So, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. How are we going to cope with that? Well, we've had the core technology to cope with this intermittency for 50, 100 years. Right? Pumped hydro is absolutely a cost-efficient technology to store electricity when we have a surplus of it, and to then release that electricity when it's needed, when those intermittent generation sources aren't operating. There was a study done recently, we'll put a link in the video, that showed that there's somewhere in the region of 100 times the world's required capacity for energy storage available just in closed loop pumped hydro systems. We already have a number of those operating in the UK, and there's more in the pipeline, gaining planning permission, moving into development all the time. So we absolutely have the solution for energy intermittency, even across the timescale of kind of days and weeks. There's also new tech coming in the form of batteries. So batteries are getting bigger and cheaper all the time. So you'll see more grid scale batteries being deployed. Those are already available. They're already financeable. They're in deployment. And actually, E.ON, our parent company, they're in the process of building a battery at the moment of a very significant scale. Beyond that, we also need to be looking at interconnection. So it may not be sunny here, but it's definitely sunny the other side of the world. We need to be looking at getting our major power markets better connected together so that we can share the renewable resources that we all have available to us. So absolutely some behavioural change is important in the journey. I think we could do net zero completely without behavioural change if necessary. Now, renewable power is now the cheapest form of power out there. So eventually the market mechanism will just mean that takes over absolutely all usage. So that part's in train. But some behavioural change is useful. So this starts with making sure that we are measuring our energy use correctly, and from a business perspective, being efficient about that energy use. One of the most important things that every business can do is make sure that they've got modern metering arrangements for their consumption, so they can see when they're using energy. This means making sure all of your sites are on AMR, so automated meter readings. That will set us up really nicely to go through the market-wide transition, which will set the whole energy market up much better to be flexible and to shift our energy usage to when that energy is most available from our renewable sources. So getting the network reinforced is one of the most important parts of the net zero transition. And in the UK, we have a problem with mega projects. Building stuff is actually quite hard in this country, mostly driven by the planning system. And I know that a lot of renewable developers are really frustrated by the pace of network reinforcement because you're getting grid connection times far, far in the future, makes it really difficult to finance projects, makes it difficult for us to push forward with our net zero agenda. Now, the good news is that tech is coming to the rescue in this part of the transition. So There's a small company in the US. They're testing a technology that has a slightly different makeup of the way that the transmission cables between the pylons, what materials they're made of, how they're manufactured, and that has the potential to triple the capacity of the existing grid. Now, that won't solve all of our issues, but it'd be an amazing step forward, because you wouldn't need planning to just change what the wires are made of. You could just change what the wires are made of. National Grid are actually invested in that company. Again, we'll put a link in the notes. And it's super exciting tech for me. This is the kind of technology-driven breakthrough that will, is not necessary for the transition, but will just turbocharge our progress. And every ton of carbon we can save now is a ton of carbon not emitted, and that's what's super important to me.